There is something profoundly misunderstood about silence. We live in a world that insists, almost tyrannically, that everything meaningful must be spoken, declared, made explicit. But that's not how human beings actually function. That's not how truth reveals itself in the deeper layers of personality. Because when a man misses someone, truly misses someone, it doesn't always erupt into grand gestures or desperate messages. It doesn't necessarily collapse into chaos or emotional display. Instead, it often retreats, it reorganizes, it becomes quiet but not empty. And that's where people make a catastrophic mistake. They assume that silence is absence. They assume that distance is detachment. But what if that's not true? What if silence is not the absence of feeling, but the containment of it? What if it's not that nothing is happening, but that everything is happening beneath the surface where words are insufficient? You see, a man who is wrestling with genuine longing is also wrestling with something else: order, pride, identity, the unbearable tension between reaching out and maintaining control over his own vulnerability. And so what emerges is not confession, but signal, subtle shifts in behavior, small, almost imperceptible changes in pattern, actions that don't announce themselves, but reveal themselves if you're paying attention. Because the truth is this: people don't just speak with their words, they speak with their habits. They speak with their habits, their timing, their restraint, their hesitation. And if you learn to see that, if you learn to decode what is quietly being expressed, you begin to understand something far more powerful than surface level communication. You begin to understand human nature itself. So when you ask the question, what does it look like when a man misses you? You're not just asking about behavior, you're asking about the hidden language of longing. And that is where things get interesting. Absence is a force that people routinely underestimate, and yet it may be one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms governing human attachment. You don't notice it when everything is readily available. In fact, abundance blinds you. When something or someone is consistently present, the mind does what it always does. It normalizes. It reduces the extraordinary to the familiar, the meaningful to the expected, and the valuable to something almost invisible. Not because it lacks worth, but because it lacks contrast. And that is the problem. Because human perception is not calibrated to recognize value in isolation. It is calibrated to recognize difference. You see things in contrast, not in continuity. Light only becomes visible because there is darkness. Sound only matters because there is silence. And presence, constant, predictable, uninterrupted presence, loses its psychological weight precisely because it ceases to be contrasted against absence. So when something disappears, even partially, even subtly, it disrupts that equilibrium. It introduces a gap where certainty once existed. And that gap does something to the human mind that is both unsettling and clarifying at the same time. It forces reevaluation because now, instead of passively experiencing something, you are confronted with its absence. And absence is not neutral. It is not empty. It is filled with memory, projection, and meaning. The mind rushes in to fill what is no longer there, and in doing so, it reconstructs the value of what has been lost, often amplifying it beyond what was consciously recognized before. This is why people begin to remember things differently when someone is no longer around. The small gestures become significant. The tone of voice, the presence in a room, the predictability of interaction, things that once felt ordinary begin to acquire emotional weight, not because they have changed, but because your relationship to them has changed. You are no longer experiencing them. You are interpreting their absence, and interpretation is where value is constructed. Now, this becomes even more complex when you consider the role of identity and pride, particularly in men who are not always encouraged or even equipped to articulate their emotional states directly. When presence is available, there is no urgency to understand it. But when absence appears, it creates a kind of internal pressure, a tension between what was and what is, and that tension demands resolution. But resolution does not always come in the form of expression. It often comes in the form of contemplation, quiet, persistent, sometimes uncomfortable contemplation. the kind that happens when distractions fade and the mind is left to grapple with its own unresolved attachments. And here is where absence becomes transformative, because it strips away the superficial layers of interaction and exposes something deeper. It forces an individual to confront not just the other person's value, but their own emotional investment. It asks a difficult question, one that cannot easily be ignored. What did this person actually mean to you? And that question is not trivial, because to answer it honestly requires a confrontation with vulnerability. It requires an admission that something outside of yourself held significance, that it mattered. And for many people, especially those who have built their identity around control, independence, or emotional restraint, that is not an easy thing to admit. So instead of expressing it outwardly, they experience it inwardly. They think more than they speak. They revisit conversations. They analyze moments that once seemed insignificant. They notice patterns that were previously invisible. And slowly, almost reluctantly, they begin to recognize that the absence is not just external, it has created an internal shift, a reorganization of priorities. Because what absence does at its core is it removes the illusion of permanence. It confronts you with the reality that what you assumed would always be there might not be, and that realization carries weight. It introduces a sense of scarcity into something that once felt abundant, and scarcity changes perception. It sharpens attention. It heightens awareness. It forces you to see what you previously overlooked, not because you suddenly became more perceptive, but because the conditions of perception have changed. And this is why absence can reveal value in a way that presence cannot. Presence allows for comfort, stability, continuity, and those are not insignificant things. They are necessary for building trust and connection, but they also create a kind of psychological inertia, a tendency to remain in a state of passive engagement. Absence disrupts that. It removes the comfort and replaces it with uncertainty, and uncertainty is not comfortable, but it is clarifying. It forces the mind to engage actively rather than passively, to question rather than assume, to reflect rather than simply experience. And in that reflection, value becomes visible, not always immediately, not always clearly, but inevitably, because the human mind is not designed to ignore meaningful loss. It is designed to process it, to understand it, to integrate it into a broader narrative of experience. And in doing so, it often elevates the significance of what has been lost. Now, this does not mean that absence creates value where none existed. That would be naive. Absence is not a magician. It does not transform the meaning into the meaningful. What it does is reveal what was already there, but not fully recognized. It is a lens, not a creator. And that distinction matters, because it means that the impact of absence is proportional to the depth of what existed before it. Superficial connections do not gain profound meaning through absence. They fade, they dissolve, they are replaced. But meaningful connections, those are different. They persist, they echo, they leave traces that cannot easily be erased. And when those traces are no longer reinforced by presence, they do not disappear. They become more noticeable, more defined, more significant. And this is where the paradox emerges, because the very thing that creates distance also creates clarity. The very thing that removes interaction also intensifies awareness. And the very thing that feels like loss can become a source of understanding, when understanding is not the same as action. And this is where many people remain stuck. They recognize the value of what is absent, but they do not know what to do with that recognition. They hesitate, they overanalyze, they wait, because acting on that realization requires something that is far more difficult than simply acknowledging it. It requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to step out of the safety of internal reflection and into the uncertainty of external expression, to risk rejection, to risk misinterpretation, to risk the possibility that the absence has already created too much distance to bridge, and that is not an easy risk to take. So instead, many remain silent, but silence, as we've already established, is not empty. It is filled with thought, with emotion, with unresolved tension. It is a space where value has been recognized, but not yet acted upon, and that space can persist for a long time, longer than it should, because the longer absence continues, the more complex the internal narrative becomes. Memory begins to reshape itself. Idealization can occur. Doubt can creep in. What was once a clear recognition of value can become entangled in uncertainty. And yet, despite all of that complexity, the fundamental truth remains: you do not fully understand the value of something when it is constantly in front of you. You understand it when it is no longer there, not because absence is inherently better than presence, but because it forces a different kind of engagement, a deeper, more reflective, more honest engagement. And that is what makes it powerful. Because in a world that constantly pushes you toward distraction, toward noise, toward immediate gratification, absence does the opposite. It slows you down. It removes the noise. It creates space. And in that space, you are left with something that is increasingly rare: clarity. Clarity about what mattered. Clarity about what was taken for granted. Clarity about what you lost, not just externally, but internally. And once you have that clarity, you cannot unsee it. The only question that remains is what you will do with it. Because recognizing value after absence is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a decision about whether that recognition will remain internal, another silent realization buried beneath pride and hesitation, or whether it will be translated into something real, something expressed, something acted upon. And that is where the real challenge begins. There is a peculiar and often uncomfortable truth about human communication, and it is this: what people choose not to say frequently carries more weight than everything they articulate. That runs counter to what you've been taught, because modern culture places an almost obsessive emphasis on verbal expression. Say how you feel, speak your truth, communicate clearly. And while there is undeniable value in clarity and articulation, there is also a profound naivety in assuming that words are the most honest medium through which human beings reveal themselves. They are not. Words are tools, and like all tools, they can be used to build something truthful or to construct something misleading. They are shaped by intention, filtered through self-awareness, constrained by fear, and often manipulated by desire. When someone speaks, they are not merely expressing what they feel. They are also deciding how they want to be perceived. That introduces distortion, not necessarily because they are lying in a malicious sense, but because they are editing, selecting, framing. And that editing process is precisely where honesty begins to erode, because to speak is to choose. To leave something out is also to choose. And those omissions, the things that remain unsaid, are not random. They are deeply revealing. They point toward the boundaries of a person's comfort, the limits of their vulnerability, and the internal conflicts they have not yet resolved. You have to understand this. People do not simply fail to say things by accident. Silence is rarely accidental. It is often the result of tension. The tension between what is felt and what is safe to express. The tension between authenticity and self-protection. And that tension manifests in very subtle ways. A hesitation before answering a question. A change in tone when a particular topic arises. A tendency to redirect conversation away from something meaningful towards something trivial. These are not insignificant behaviors. They are signals, indicators that something exists beneath the surface that has not been verbalized. And here's where it becomes psychologically complex, because what is unsaid is not constrained by the structure of language. It is not packaged neatly into sentences or organized into coherent arguments. It exists in a more raw, unfiltered form. It leaks out through behavior, through timing, through inconsistency. And because of that, it is often more difficult to detect, but also more difficult to fake. Anyone can construct a convincing narrative with words. That requires a certain level of intelligence and social awareness, but it is entirely possible. What is far more difficult is maintaining alignment between what is said and what is done, between what is expressed and what is avoided. And that misalignment is where truth reveals itself. Because when there is a discrepancy between someone's words and their behavior, you are faced with a choice. Do you believe what they say, or do you pay attention to what they consistently demonstrate? And if you are paying attention carefully, if you are not blinded by what you want to hear, you will begin to notice that behavior particularly the absence of certain behaviors, is often far more reliable than verbal expression. Now, this is especially relevant when you consider emotional experiences that are difficult to articulate. Not all feelings translate easily into language. In fact, many of the most significant human experiences, loss, longing, regret, attachment, are inherently resistant to precise verbalization. They are complex, layered, sometimes contradictory. And when someone is confronted with those kinds of emotions, especially if they lack the tools or the willingness to articulate them, they do not simply disappear. They find alternative routes of expression. Often those routes are indirect. A person might not say that they miss someone, but they might find reasons to remain connected in small, seemingly insignificant ways. They might not express regret, but they might revisit past interactions, bring up old memories, or linger in conversations longer than memories, or linger in conversations longer than necessary. They might not admit vulnerability, but they might become unusually attentive or reactive in situations that touch on that vulnerability. These behaviors are not random. They are expressions of something that has not been put into words. And the reason they have not been put into words matters. Sometimes it is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of appearing weak, fear of losing control. Sometimes it is pride, the unwillingness to expose something that could be used against them. Sometimes it is confusion, the inability to fully understand what they are feeling, let alone communicate it effectively. But regardless of the reason, the result is the same. The truth exists, but it is not spoken. And paradoxically, that can make it more honest. Because once something is spoken, it enters the realm of interpretation and manipulation. It can be shaped to achieve a particular outcome. It can be softened, exaggerated, or strategically timed. It becomes part of a social exchange, subject to all the complexities and compromises that social interaction entails. What remains unsaid, however, is not subject to those same constraints. It is closer to the source. It is less filtered. It is, in many cases, a more direct reflection of internal reality. But, and this is crucial, that does not mean it is easier to understand. In fact, it is often much harder, because to interpret what is unsaid requires attention. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to observe patterns over time rather than relying on isolated statements. It requires you to tolerate ambiguity, to resist the urge for immediate clarity, and to accept that not everything meaningful will be handed to you in a straightforward manner, and that is not something people are naturally inclined to do. Most people prefer explicit communication because it reduces uncertainty. It provides clear signals, clear expectations, clear conclusions. It simplifies interaction. But simplicity comes at a cost. It can obscure nuance. It can mask inconsistency. It can create a false sense of understanding, because just because something has been said does not mean it is true. And just because something has not been said does not mean it is absent. This is where a more sophisticated understanding of human behavior becomes necessary. You have to learn to listen, not just to words, but to patterns, to timing, to what is consistently avoided, to what emerges under pressure, to what changes when circumstances shift. Because people reveal themselves most clearly not when they are carefully constructing their message, but when they are navigating situations they cannot fully control. And in those moments, what is unsaid often becomes visible, not through direct expression, but through deviation, through the gap between expectation and reality, through the subtle ways in which behavior contradicts narrative. And if you are paying attention, those contradictions are incredibly informative. They tell you where the truth is not aligned with the story. They point toward the areas where something is being withheld consciously or unconsciously, and they invite you to look deeper, not in a paranoid or accusatory way, but in a way that acknowledges the complexity of human psychology. Because the goal is not to catch people in deception. The goal is to understand them, to recognize that everyone is navigating their own internal landscape, filled with fears, desires, uncertainties, and unresolved conflicts. And that what they say is only one layer of that landscape. What they do not say, what they cannot say, or will not say, that is another layer entirely. And often it is the more revealing one. But with that understanding comes responsibility. Because Once you begin to recognize the significance of what is unsaid, you also have to decide how you will respond to it. Will you ignore it because it is inconvenient or uncomfortable? Will you confront it directly, risking disruption, or will you simply acknowledge it, allowing it to inform your perception without forcing immediate resolution? There is no simple answer to that because every situation is different. Every individual is different, and not all silence carries the same meaning. Some silence is protective, some is manipulative, some is temporary, some is permanent, and the challenge is in discerning the difference, and that requires something that cannot be reduced to a formula. It requires judgment, the kind of judgment that develops over time through experience, through attention, through the willingness to engage with complexity rather than retreat from it. Because the truth is, human communication is not a clean, linear process. It is layered, it is dynamic, it is often contradictory, and if you limit your understanding to what is explicitly stated, you will miss a significant portion of what is actually being communicated. But if you learn to recognize the weight of what is unsaid, to see it not as absence, but as information, you begin to operate at a different level of awareness. You begin to see patterns where others see noise. You begin to detect meaning where others see ambiguity. And most importantly, you begin to understand that honesty is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is hesitant. Sometimes it exists in the space between words, in the pauses, in the omissions, in the things that are felt but not expressed. And if you can learn to listen to that, to truly listen, without imposing your own assumptions or desires onto it, you will gain access to a level of insight that most people overlook. Because what is unsaid does not demand your attention, it requires it. And that is precisely why it is so often more honest than what is spoken. In the end, what is absent and what is unspoken are not empty spaces, they are mirrors. They reflect value, truth, and emotional reality with a clarity that words often distort. If you learn to pay attention, not just to what is said, but to what is withheld, you begin to understand people at a deeper level, because real meaning is rarely loud or obvious. Because real meaning is rarely loud or obvious. It is subtle, restrained, and often hidden beneath pride and fear. And once you see it, you realize that silence is not the absence of truth. It is where truth quietly reveals itself.